Okay, good morning to everybody. Today is Thursday. This is the end of week 9. So today we're going to cover chapter 12. We have been leading up to it a bit, and some of the content relating to consumption and investment went ahead and sort of moved up a little bit, and in order to sort of lay some of the groundwork, particularly, excuse me, for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I think it's really important for us to be really cognizant, particularly what aggregate demand is all about, because it's really composed of those 4 elements of spending that we talked about early on in the class: the idea of consumption, investment, government spending, and the difference between exports and imports and exports. And so we sort of went over that. We talked a bit about the multiplier. Now it's going to sort of come into its own today as we talk about what we would refer to as Keynesian theory. Before I do that, though, I've just got a little bit of catching up here to do. And that is talking about some other changes in, and I'll shift the camera over here in just a second, in terms of price level changes. And I want to sort of revisit just the very last thing we talked about in class on Tuesday. And that was this idea of additional forms in terms of types of inflation. And I know that we talked about inflation beginning back in chapter 9, where we really got into that discussion in a big way, talked about the kinds of what inflation was, how we defined it, why it's a problem, what to do about it, etc. The what to do about it is going to come a bit later in the class when we get more into policy. So if I had to characterize this third segment of the class, and I define the segment as being, sort of punctuated by the exams, I would call this more of a theory part of the class, and then the policy portion is going to come in the 4th section. So we talked about demand pull, which is probably the most common form of inflation, really. It's the idea that all goods and services can and often does outstrip the ability of the supply side to catch up. And the reason for this, I think, is very simple, because demand can be managed fairly quickly through a combination of fiscal and monetary policies. We haven't really talked about these yet. I know your text gets into a little bit of an introduction early on in the text about what fiscal policy is, about what monetary policy is. I've been alluding to these a little bit, but I'll come back and we'll certainly talk about these in the policy part of the class. But what I'm saying is that demand can be managed fairly quickly. And we simply saw this happen with stimulus checks that we all got, or most of us got, in the mail or in our bank accounts in the last 2 or 3 years during the pandemic. Or it can do it in a little slower fashion by monetary policy, by lowering interest rates. There are some issues with lowering interest rates, and that is the fact that maybe that does not translate into demand for goods right away, because you really can't make borrowers borrow and you can't make lenders lend. And so that's a bit of a shortcoming with monetary policy, but we will get to that. In fact, we're going to get to that a bit later in today's class session. The other form is cost push, which is the bottom one there. That's when it's something that's going on with the supply side, aggregate supply of lots of elements of the economy, and as a result, it simply results in shortages. And what do shortages do? They force the prices of goods up. And I think, as I mentioned on Tuesday, I think that probably we can attribute some of the inflation that we're seeing now with something that really began, I think, on the supply side with during the pandemic, with lots of shortages of lots of goods, frankly. And the fact of the matter is that people probably panicked. I think that's probably safe to say, with a lot of these goods, and bid the prices of these goods up, pulled goods off shelves, force the prices up. And one of the true axioms of business is that off shelves, sellers are going to raise the price of goods. There's just this is just a no-brainer. And so as a result, that's what got the inflation ball rolling. And then I think with all the stimulus that we poured into the economy with stimulus checks, and it wasn't just stimulus checks to households, it was also relief to businesses. And frankly, some of these households and businesses probably didn't, quote unquote, need it. And it was fairly, they were set up fairly indiscriminately. But to be in fairness, I don't know how you discriminate between who needs and who doesn't need a stimulus check. And so basically went to pretty much everybody. On households, it was everybody below a certain income level who got it. And businesses, it was a much more widely indiscriminate, to the point where now we're starting to see some money quarterbacking about some firms that have sort of cheated their way into getting stimulus checks and loans and relief that they really didn't qualify for. But I think what happened, though, is so we started hearing and we sort of poured on the gas. And I think that an interesting line of inquiry going on in the Congress right now is whether or not business firms are really taking advantage of this inflationary environment to raise prices and raise prices excessively. And I think it's a worthwhile argument to have, frankly, because we're starting to see some businesses expand their margins. And margin expansion is simply the price of the good that they sell to buyers minus the average cost to produce the good. And so if those are expanding, it simply means they're doing it somehow. Either they're lowering costs, which they're not, I don't think. In an inflationary environment, how do you lower costs? Or they're raising the prices, which I think is very definitely the definition of inflation. So I think that's a worthwhile inquiry to have, is are businesses trying to take advantage of this opportunity? And I think the answer is yes. My experience in the business world is that if a firm can raise prices, it will. And there's no reason not to, frankly. And in fact, I think there's a lot of pressure on the part of businesses to do so, particularly if they've got investors and lenders and everybody to sort of get well during an inflationary period, which in the beginning stages tends to be probably next week. We talk about the classical theory about what some of the issues are with inflation. By the way, I didn't mention a second ago that we're going to cover chapter 13 next week. So chapter 12 today, we're going to talk about Keynesian theory. This is the theory part of the class. And then next week, we're going to talk about classical or neoclassical theory. It's the neoclassical part of it comes about because of the fact that classical theory has been around for a couple hundred years at least. And neoclassical theory is more of a 20th century adaptation, modernization, whichever you prefer, a twist on some of those themes that arose really in the 1800s primarily, but we're picked up on and carried forward by some economists. And we'll be getting to those next week. But today we'll talk more about Keynesian theory. One final piece of business, though, and by the way, the slides for this are all in week 8. So I know if you're wondering, hey, where are the PowerPoint slides for week 9? Well, they're all in week 8. I think I got a little bit ahead of myself in putting all these slides together. I think the last time I used this particular slide package was when I did like an 8-week class or whatever. And you know, we probably did get through all this in a very short period of time. But some of this is, so let's look on week 8. All the stuff that we're going to have in terms of the PowerPoints are on week 8, in the week 8 module. Okay. So I want to talk before we get going forward about something called disinflation and a couple of other terms, hyperinflation and stagflation. So the previous slide dealt with the forms of inflation, but here are some additional forms. These are a little bit less common, but yet are terms that you want to be familiar with. Those look like good exam questions to me. The first is something called disinflation. So remember, we had inflation, which is a general rise in the overall price level. That's the definition of inflation. General rise, so it's across the economy. It's not confined or unique to any one particular good or class of goods. And deflation is just the opposite. It's a fall of the price level. So what is disinflation? Is that a form of deflation? And we're saying no. It is not the same as deflation. It's a policy goal of bringing down whatever the rate of inflation is right now. Right now, this is the major policy goal that's going on in the US government, particularly and almost exclusively, frankly, at the monetary policy level. And I know that it's almost impossible in an econ course to not talk about the Federal Reserve as we get going. And I know we haven't really gotten into them yet. We'll be getting into them a bit later, and probably should do a class session early on in the semester just to define who they are. And it's our central bank, and they control the money supply, they control interest rates, and really they're the agency responsible for dealing with price level issues. Right now, they've been talking endlessly about disinflation, which is a term that they really haven't been using in the 1970s. And it's interesting because I was sort of banging around looking at old policy statements, old academic papers, because this is kind of what I do. And the term inflation came up again and again and again in the 1970s. We want to get disinflation going. That is, we want to bring down the rate of inflation. We don't want negative price level changes. We don't want deflation because, remember, on Tuesday, I think I sort of posed this to the class, which is worse, inflation or deflation? If you had to pick your poison, which would you rather have? And I feel that pretty confident that most economists would say they would prefer inflation to deflation, even though deflation may be easier to deal with because you simply pump up the money supply and send out stimulus and all these kinds of things. The problem with deflation is that it usually is a harbinger of something really bad that's happened to your economy. It's really a sign of something that's really really broken in your economy. So you don't want deflation, even though it may be easier to cure. inflation is itself not easy to cure, and it's one of the problems. When we talked about the problems with inflation is the fact that once it gets going, it's difficult to stop. So disinflation is a goal. Right now, we're trying to get down to 2%. That's the goal the Federal Reserve is set for inflationary conditions in the economy. 2%, okay? And there are some doubt as to whether or not they're going to get there, because for a lot of years, they were trying to get up to 2%. And now we're going to try to go from 6 to 2 sometime, hopefully this year. I know that the Federal Reserve chairman just yesterday said they'd like to see massive decreases in the price level this year, and which means essentially they're going to try to hit the brakes on the economy a little harder, I think, than what they've been doing, although they've been doing a lot. It just hasn't really sunk in yet, I don't think, frankly. All right, a couple other price level changes. We'll get into the Keynesian model, and that is hyperinflation. And that is a very rapid increase in prices, usually associated with the fact that your money supply is close to being worthless, frankly. And that's a condition in which prices are rising so rapidly that people really lose confidence in the currency itself, and usually sort of gravitate towards some other medium of exchange, like the currency, some other country's currency, or gold, or something, or even something non-monetary, like I guess maybe cigarettes. Even that's probably not as much in demand as in previous years, but nonetheless, that's an example. The sort of example case of this was Germany in the 1920s, which is almost always the signal case that stands out that economists have been using for years, because it's almost a perfect example of a condition of hyperinflation. Now, by the way, what's really interesting about this particular example, particularly given that where we're going to be in the class today, is the fact that there was some prognostication after World War I that Germany would do exactly what it did do. But it was prognosticated by a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, who said, look, the settlement that the Allied countries, that is Britain and France and Italy, had arrived at with Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, was going to bankrupt Germany. And Germany was going to pay all these debts to the victorious powers. And as a result, it would mean they probably would just print more money and pay the debts, and they'd have massive inflation and all these kinds of things that were coming up. Massive inflation, probably a radicalization of the government. We're probably going to have a dictatorship take over in Germany. And really, World War I was just the first half of what is going to be another world war. When Keynes said this back in around 1919, people thought he was absolutely insane. He was dismissed from the British Treasury. And yet he happened to be right on every single one of those points, which is why I think Keynes has sort of made his mark as sort of being the Einstein of the economics world. Hyperinflation did result in Germany. In fact, Germany was so out of control that German workers would get 2 lunch breaks, one to actually have lunch and the other to go buy goods before they went up that day. And this, what you see happening is goods no longer printed, prices no longer printed, simply written on chalk, and they change throughout the day, sometimes doubling every day in terms of prices. This is a country that's out of control. And today, the only example we've got, it's such a ridiculous example, is the African state of Zimbabwe, which has had such hyperinflation for so many years now that nobody's even taking that currency seriously. Not even the people in Zimbabwe, and they're simply using other currencies like the US dollar and the euro to transact business. I went to a conference a few years ago, and they were giving out $10 million currency notes, $10 million Zimbabwe dollars to everybody. And it's like, what are these worth? I think they're worth like 20 cents or something. That's how ridiculous the currency has gotten. And it's a particularly broken state anyway, in terms of the government. So hyperinflation is when that monetary situation is broken down. By the way, how did Germany fix some of the problems? Well, some of it reversed itself because the economy worldwide started to boom in the 1920s. And so that solved some of their problems. And then when the Nazis came to power, they simply replaced the currency and introduced their own brand new currency, which is probably what should have done been done early on. And today, when we see this condition happening, we usually see Mexico had a similar problem, although I don't think you could define it as hyperinflation. They had a similar inflationary problem, and what Mexico did was not particularly novel, but was very smart, and that was simply tie the peso, the Mexican peso, to the value of the US dollar, and as a result, immediately stopped the run on the peso. And so the peso is now pretty strong currency, even though it's, I think, worth 8 cents to the dollar. That's irrelevant. It's the rate of change that's the big issue. Okay. Then finally, stagflation. So what is stagflation about? So there's something called the Phillips curve, and I want to talk a bit about that, and we'll sort of make our way over to the Keynesian model. the Phillips curve is basically this relationship between inflation and unemployment. And let's talk a bit about what that is. And devised essentially by a British, actually a New Zealand economist named, Bill Phillips. And I think every time I hit this button here, I do something wrong with the camera. So give me a second here to sort of make this right here. And so Phillips was an economist at the London School of Economics in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, and he did research on data as to price level changes in the US and Britain in the 1940s and 50s primarily. Okay, so let's talk a bit about what the Phillips model is about here. I think I've swiveled the camera now. Phillips was saying, look, because we've already talked about this idea, about the idea of being the two main dangers in economics, and that is we're trying to solve against, and we're trying to deal against two things that are both measured in percentage terms. First of these is inflation on the one hand, which is expressed as a percentage, and unemployment on the other hand, which is also expressed as a percentage. And so Phillips was looking at data and sort of tried to plot a correlation. And basically said, and found, you might have some outliers here, but you found something like this. Like that. So the Phillips curve is a downward sloping phenomenon. And what it basically said was this. Okay, so if you want to, I'll use the term pick your poison again. And it's really a dilemma that policymakers have been facing, at least in the short run, forever. And it continues to go on forever. And even to today, I think there are a lot of people who would prefer that we not deal with inflation and keep unemployment where it is. Just yesterday, Senator Elizabeth Warren was fighting hard in her testimony, in his testimony before the Senate, basically blaming him for causing a rise in unemployment if they deal with inflation. So here's the thing: if you have a high inflation rate, like we do right now, and a low unemployment rate, so let's just take the current data, about 6%, a 3% unemployment rate. Then what is the dilemma? The dilemma is, what if you try to bring it down to 2%? And as a result, you get something like 7% unemployment. In other words, it's a whack-a-mole game in the sense that if you try to beat down the inflation monster, okay, you end up raising the unemployment rate. And I know these are maybe kind of faint for the camera, to see 6% going to 2, 3% going to 7. So simply put, the idea is that if you hit one wall, another wall pops up. And you can reverse this trend and say, okay, if you want to deal with high unemployment, then you speed the economy up. You print more money, you give stimulus, you get inflation ignites. And so you hit that wall and the other wall pops up. So this is a dilemma. And so the idea is, okay, is there a happy medium? And I think most economists would shoot for a happy medium to be. So I think it's particularly interesting because the Phillips curve sort of breaks down in the long run. And we'll talk about that. And there's a natural reason why I talked about this with stagflation. It's the idea that okay, not only do you have this dilemma in the short run as to what you do, and by the way, where in the middle do you settle here? Where do you settle here? I mean, where in the middle do you want to settle? Do you want to pick 4% inflation and 4% unemployment, 5% inflation, 5% unemployment? What's the number? And given particularly the fact that these aren't easily managed in the first place, it's not the case that we can always simply just manage the inflation rate or manage the unemployment rate. I think a lot of times we have this idea that the government has got all these tools at their disposal, and they do, but they're not always magically working. So, no, I didn't see that, but I did see some of the testimony. Yeah, some Powell in front of the. I thought the questioning by Elizabeth Warren was really out of control in the sense that she was saying, "What would you say to the people who are going to lose their jobs because you're lowering the inflation rate?" And I thought it was. I didn't like the line of testimony because I think that what it was saying was that he is deliberately trying to put people out of work, like he's some kind of criminal mastermind, twirling his fingers. And
I also watched there was a Teamsters Union representative kind of budget committee. Yes,
I didn't see that.
That was good.
I did not see. So, but I mean, and Powell's answer was, look, we're just trying to bring the inflation rate down. That's our mandate. And by the way, he's saying, look, how many families are hurt by high inflation right now? Every family is hurt by high inflation, but maybe some families are going to be hurt by unemployment, which is a pretty good answer. He was pretty fast on his feet, I thought, with that answer. Everyone is affected by inflation. This is why we talked early on, and back in chapter 9, we talked about the problems with inflation. And this is one of the problems, is that you can't hide from inflation. I mean, there's really no, unless you're a total, off the grid kind of person. These people live, these TV shows that people live off the grid, they're cutting their own firewood and shooting animals and all that. I mean, they're affected by inflation. If you trade with anybody else, and that's most of us, right? So that's an issue. So this, folks, is a dilemma. And it basically poses for policymakers this challenge of what to do. Now, to add even more complexity to it, in most industrial countries like our own, the agencies that deal with this are different than the agencies that deal with this. Inflation is dealt with by monetary authorities, our Federal Reserve, and unemployment is mostly dealt with by the fiscal authorities, Congress and the president. Unelected versus elected officials, and so you've already got a conflict going on there. Obviously, the elected officials argue for low unemployment, hence the argument by Senator Warren, we don't want unemployment to go up. Well, unemployment is probably well below what we call full employment right now anyway, so it's probably going to go up eventually at some point. If we don't deal with inflation, inflation will deal with us, I think is probably the way to look at this. But the fact of the matter is no members of Congress or the president want unemployment to go up. But there are times when inflation's got to come down as a result in the short run. The reason why is you're slowing the economy down. You are trying to slow the economy by bringing the inflation rate down by raising borrowing costs. It makes it more expensive for people to buy homes, and the housing industry right now has just gotten pummeled. I mean, just new construction, and there are projects still going on, but they've already been started and they've already probably locked in a lot of their financing. But I think you're probably going to see this. And so it takes a little bit of time for this to sort of take hold there. Yeah.
I did listen to a marketplace on the radio, and they were talking about Shutterfly.
What?
Shutterfly, how they're trying to raise wages at their term and decrease CEO wages to balance out, make sure everyone stays on. They want long-term employees.
Well, that would be a novel approach to take. CEOs taking a pay cut, everybody else getting a raise. That would be something new.
Yeah.
That's not very common. That's I think most workers across the economy would like to see that happen, because I think most workers are under no illusion that CEO wages have gotten completely out of control. And that's a whole other set. We get into that more in micro for sure. All right, so what about this dilemma that's being posed here? And of course we use these metaphors between the automotive metaphors come up again and again. You've got one ditch on the left side of the road, that's inflation. We want to try to steer away from that. But if we go too far in the other direction, we get unemployment going on. So as a result, we want to steer back the other way. And so we want to sort of find some middle ground, which is frankly fairly undefined. Right now, most economists would believe that full employment is probably somewhere between 4 and 5%. And we would simply define that as full employment, meaning that it's 4 to 5%. And let's just call it, let's put the difference and say 4.5%, okay? That everybody who wants to work can find a job, and there's no cyclical unemployment. Okay. Now here's the problem with the Phillips curve. By the late 1970s, here was the problem. This is a good short-term model, but by the 1970s, the entire curve is shifting to the right and shifting to the right. So as a result, you had increased inflation and unemployment. They were both going up. So both inflation was going up, and inflation and unemployment was going up. And that's what the definition of stagflation is. This is why the Phillips curve model is considered to be valid in the short run, not particularly useful in the long run. And so this is really a policy concept that mostly describes what the short-term decision-making is. And again, the short run and the long run are frankly pretty ill-defined in macro, and I understand that. So, and I understand maddening to try to define where the long run begins. At what point we cross the finish line from the short run to the long run. But one thing is that we saw this phenomenon happen with stagflation. Now, by the way, this Phillips curve looked like pretty good theory, almost to the point where it was almost considered a law of economics. And I remember I was in college at the time, and that supposedly, and I wasn't part of this, but privy to this, but supposedly textbook publishers were saying to economists, you guys need to figure this problem out before we print any more new macro textbooks, which I find to be startling. I've never heard any publisher academics to say, fix this dilemma, in order to for us to publish again, because this is really wrong. You've got a wrong-headed view of the economy. If you don't have this right, what do you have right? So, and I remember being an undergraduate, and I saw there was an article that one of my professors had clipped out of the Wall Street Journal and pasted on her door, or taped on her door. And the article was entitled, What Good Are Economists Anyway? And it was basically, which was pretty early as somebody trained to be an economist, that it was if you can't figure this out, what is it that you can figure out? Well, I think the issue is that this is a short run view. The long run view, where stagflation could take place, is a little bit is a real possibility. And there has been subsequent work in this area, particularly by the Canadian economist named Robert Mundell, who actually won the Nobel Prize. Phillips did not win the Nobel Prize because he dropped dead early and being a life. So it's my daily rant against smoking, right? So but the Nobel Prizes are not awarded to deceased people. But Mundell did a lot of work and said, look, stagflation is actually very possible. There are these examples where you can have both. You can have a very slow economy and very high inflation. They both can take place at the same time. And by the way, which is the bigger monster that gets the whole thing going? And he pointed to inflation. And if you can't control inflation, why would inflation stoke a sluggish growth rate and high unemployment? It's because of the fact that, particularly by the late 70s, businesses were saying, look, we don't know, we can't make long-term decisions because the price of our product is going to be in 10 years, in 5 years. We don't really understand what our hiring decisions are going to be. We really don't want to hire people and open a new plant and then close it in 5 years because the price doesn't match up our cost structure. We don't know what the wages are going to be. We don't know what wage contracts are going to look like. And add to that the already uncertain element of taxation, which is always unclear because we keep changing our tax code all the time. All these different variables going on, firms say, you know what, we're good for right now. We're going to stay pat. We're not going to do very much because we need to see some clarity. We don't know what's happening. Inflation is really distorting a lot of things. We like to borrow money because it's better to borrow money during inflationary times, but we really don't know what to do with it because we don't know what kind of plans we should be making. Okay, so that's the idea of the stagflation concept. Phillips was looking pretty good until the stagflation event in the 1970s and early 1980s. But I think the better explanation is the issue is inflation. And by the way, the policymakers that are trying to deal with inflation right now are looking at inflation much more than they are unemployment. So what I thought Powell could have easily said, and somebody with a little bit less temperament would have said to Elizabeth Powell, was that you don't really understand how this works or whatever, because I mean, he could have easily said that. She's not really his boss. I mean, to be honest with you, but instead he said, look, everyone's impacted by inflation and unemployment is not everyone's problem at all. That's pretty much what he said. But he could have said something to the effect that, inflation we've got to get it under control because if we don't get it under control, everything else can break down the economy. And that's why we need to do this. And this is why it's going to, and people are going to lose their jobs. And that's not an easy thing for anybody in government to say. People are going to lose their jobs. It is an effect, but not an intended effect. It's an unintended effect. But what choice do we have? And he said, look, these are the tools that are at our disposal. And what is it we're supposed to do otherwise? These are the tools that exist that we've got to work with. And so anyway, I thought it was an interesting exchange. And it really pointed out, if I can grab the video, maybe on YouTube or whatever, maybe we'll watch it on Tuesday. I just thought it was an interesting exchange between policymakers on the fiscal side, policymakers on the monetary side, pushing against each other for different objectives. And I thought Powell handled it pretty magnanimously. I'm not sure that a lot of economists would have had the temperament to have done so. I can imagine somebody like Larry Summers, who has been discussed as a candidate for Fed chairman, really saying, pushing back hard against his former colleague at Harvard at the time. So anyway, you get the idea that sometimes people don't agree on what policy should be. And this particularly plays out when we get into the discussion about what to do and when and who. But there's no question that people are going to be impacted by these higher interest rates that the Federal Reserve is no doubt trying to engineer. Okay, all right. So questions about any of that before we get into chapter 12. Well, let's talk about chapter 12 and talk about the aggregate expenditures model, sometimes called just simply the expenditures model or the expenditures output model. It's the same thing. And a lot of this is discussed in Appendix B, which I did not assign as reading. mostly because of the fact that I think it's probably easier just to follow along with what I think this is probably, of all the topics in the text, I think this is probably one of the more complicated. I'm not going to dwell on all the complications of this. I'm going to focus on primarily the main themes, and then we're going to go back to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And that will then set us up for the second sort of policy, for the policy debate about what to do. So the model was developed by John Maynard Keynes, British economist, in the 19th. And obviously this is 1936 was right sort of smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression. And what's interesting about Keynes, I mentioned to you at the outset that Keynes was notable early on in his career for being able to deduce and to make connections that other people were not able to identify. And I think this is really one of the things about Keynes that sort of adds to his brilliance as an economist overall. I don't think too many people dispute the fact that he was way ahead of his time in so many ways, but not just the fact that he saw what was going to happen to Germany after World War I, that the measures that the Versailles Treaty were imposing on Germany were punitive, and if they would lead to collapse in the German economy, probably a re-radicalization of that state. Really, because a lot of people wanted revenge in Germany, there's no question about that. And so he thought, how do you make people angry? It's like strangling their economy. And by the way, the German people didn't necessarily, the government didn't feel like it had actually been a loser. They just thought we came to a stalemate and we were going to make an agreement. They didn't know that they were sort of being forced into that. And so that, obviously created resentments. But Keynes was really the only one who saw that beginning to bubble up. And so he made his mark in that particular area. But by the 1930s, he established himself as a very prominent economist and wrote this book called The General Theory. Now, The General Theory is a very difficult read. I've got a couple copies at home. I've read it, and it's the great American economist, sort of a neo-Keynesian named Paul Samuelson, said it was a practically impossible read, and he's probably right. On the very first page, in fact, I think it's the very first paragraph, Keynes said, this book is primarily for professional economists. Meaning it's probably not going to make any sense to anybody else. It doesn't even make sense to, in some cases, to a lot of us. And he writes in a very sort of Victorian manner. He'll say things like not unlike. You have to think, what is not unlike? No, it means like, or more than a little, right? Which means, oh, that means a lot. I mean, it's just really, it's a difficult read. He gets on subjects, leaves them, comes back to them later, has a weird section on finance in the very end of it. And he will admit himself, and Samuels himself said it's just really badly written, needs editing, but there's nobody really to edit it because you're talking about something that's groundbreaking. And it's like when Einstein wrote some of his famous papers, he didn't even cite any references, any sources, because there were no sources. And the same kind of goes with Keynes. He's sort of making some of this up on his own. And by the way, a lot of people up till the present day don't buy all of the ideas in the general theory. We're going to see next week, when we talk about the classical and neoclassical theorists, that there are a lot of pieces of Keynes that they don't buy. And I think it's important to know that there's controversy that arises in economic theory in general. It's important for us to have that awareness. I talked about very early on in the class that there are things that we talk about here that some people just reject and don't buy. And it's not really my job to get people to, well, at least I don't think it's my job to get people to buy into particular theory. I'd rather just present theory and see what you think, and maybe you can make your own decisions. So you can make your own decisions as to whether you think this is a good set of theories or not. So first of all, what we do. So there's a reason why I got into this idea of consumption and savings, the two functions which are complementary to one another. And that is because we're going to sort of lay out a model that we need to build the aggregate expenditures model. And I will present it in as simple a way as I can by starting with some initial assumptions. And we're going to start with no government, an economy with no government, and we're going to start with an economy that's closed, that is, there are no exports or imports. And so in other words, it's kind of like a Gilligan's Island sort of country. There's no government, there are no imports or exports. And so we've got an economy that's essentially isolated. Now, why are we making those? In order to make some points that I think are necessary to make. We're going to relax these assumptions because obviously they need to be brought into the picture at some point. But we're going to make one assumption that's the value of output must be received somewhere as income. Now, this is an idea which is simple. Sometimes the simplest ideas are the most powerful. And that's the idea that my spending is your income and your spending is my income. And that is, if we cut off the income and spending cycle, somehow, for whatever reason, then it really results in a slowdown in the economy, which is one explanation for why economies reach recessionary periods. So if you want to know why we have to have business cycles, then one explanation is the demand side. And by the way, this entire model is essentially a demand side model. This is essentially one of the criticisms of Keynes by his later detractors and even by some of his contemporary detractors. And that was the idea that it was primarily a demand side model. But Keynes is unabashedly supportive of the idea that demand is much more important than supply. So this is clearly a supply side model. We're going to see, demand side model. We're going to see next time how that really plays into things. So, and then one final assumption is that actual GDP can be less than potential GDP. In fact, that is the operative assumption by which we get going with this model in the first place, is you're operating in an economy that's below full employment. Now, I know this in itself becomes a point of debate and a point of contention with those who challenge this theory by saying, well, what about an economy that's not at below full employment? Now, Keynes doesn't really have an answer, but it's also not really what he's trying to do in this particular economy with wild inflation. And I think had he lived, he died in 1956, not too long after this was published. And I think had Keynes lived longer, he probably would have had a way to respond to some of those criticisms, but simply wasn't around to do it. So let's start with the model of the economy. And remember in the last week, we got into this discussion of consumption and savings, and we simply plotted, remember we said that disposable income equals consumption plus savings. And so what did we say about that particular connection? Well, we've got three variables: disposable income, consumption, and savings, only two axes. And so we simply drew two graphs with one common axis, and that was disposable income. Well, now we're going to talk about then more than how. So we're going to talk about the entire economy. And so we're going to put Y, GDP, on the horizontal axis. And we're going to put the two elements of aggregate expenditure, and that is, remember, we have no government and no net exports, and so we're just going to include consumption plus investment. In other words, it's household spending and business spending. And we're going to go back to the 45-degree line that we talked about before. That's the line of equality, meaning what? That any value that falls along that line is considered to be what? It's considered to be equivalent to both values, because these are denominated in dollars and these are denominated in dollars. So we're talking about apples to apples. Okay. So what about expenditure here in this particular, actually, these are more or less linear. So what about consumption and investment in this particular situation? Well, consumption and investment might look something like this, right? So C plus I, which, by the way, are all of the quote unquote aggregate expenditures. That is all that exists right now. It's consumption plus investment. Okay. So consumption and investment is right there. And by the way, what is this value here? What is this interval between zero, the origin, and some value here? Well, back in the consumption model, we refer to that as autonomous consumption. And that is the ability of consumers, because it was a household model, to spend when income was zero. We know that people could do it by saving, that is by borrowing against existing or liquidating savings, borrowing money, or receiving transfers. And so as a result of this, they are able to spend. And the economy can do the same. We simply call that autonomous spending. So we're talking about spending throughout the economy in general, by businesses and households, both autonomous spending. Okay, and this is the very same equivalent area as what's going on here. Okay. And by the way, you've got this condition of macroequilibrium right here. Macroequilibrium right here. Now, one thing I will not get into very much is this idea of this region and this region here, which essentially have to do with changes in inventories. And that is the idea that you can spend more than what you're taking in because you can simply liquidate inventories. That is very possible to do. I just want to mention that just in case you do want to get into the readings and say, okay, well, why did we talk about inventories? Well, I'm just trying to simplify this a little bit, but you can operate here. One way you can spend more than what you're taking in is you can liquidate inventories. And in fact, during the Great Depression, we saw lots of that happening. And by liquidating inventories, it does allow spending in excess of disposable income. Now, there were no transfers in the 1930s. That was one thing. There were no transfer payments, didn't exist. Social Security didn't even come along until I think right after this was published. So even Social Security benefits to retirees wasn't there. Social Security was created in essence to allow people to be able to spend when their income had gone to zero. Retirees who didn't have the physical ability to go to work, and we didn't want people working until they dropped dead. And so as a result, it was created so that people currently working could pay into a fund that would pay those who are currently retired. It's exactly how how it works today. Well, not exactly, but it's more or less how it works today. That is, the money you've paid into Social Security and you are paying now if you're working is going off to those who are currently retired. Yes, there's a big fund. Yes, there's debate about Social Security, but that's what's happening. So in 10 years, I'll be retired probably, and so you'll be working, and I will thank you for paying taxes and giving me money. I'll thank you in advance for paying my Social Security. So thanks, guys. But I've already paid in for my parents, and so I'm already. Geezer was talking about that. So it is possible to spend more than what one takes in, but there are no transfers in those days. And the only way that firms could do, but that was more or less shut down. And so you get this idea of the economy being jammed up or stuck in first gear. Because here's the thing, actual GDP, which is here, and it's in equilibrium conditions, we'll put a little star by it, is right there. The problem with that is full employment GDP could be out here. That's really one of the assumptions we talked about, is full employment GDP is right there. So how do we get from here to here, which is an output gap? An output gap that we refer to as a recessionary gap. Output gaps. An output gap is simply any condition in which actual GDP is different than full employment GDP. GDP is expressed in dollar terms or pounds or euros or whatever. It's a condition in which is less than full employment, but isn't that the definition of a recession? So there's a gap. Okay, so now there's a reason why we started out with no government, and that was because of the fact that now what do? What is the way that we get to here? How do we boost this? We get this by adding another element of spending, and that is government spending, which now becomes the new aggregate expenditures. And so as a result, C plus I now becomes C plus I plus G. And so this difference here between here and here is simply what we refer to as delta G. Delta G is the change in government spending. And in other words, what government should do is spend money, Okay. Now, here's the problem and why it took so long for people to buy Keynes's ideas. There are a lot of things, and I know that a lot of economists today, a lot of modern economists are very hard on the economists of that day, and in particular, the governments of that day, for being sort of incredulous at this. President Roosevelt himself, who I think a lot of people feel exemplar of government involvement, was frankly a bit skeptical of Keynes. And Keynes visited him in his office in the White House, and after he left, said Roosevelt said, "What is he, some kind of mathematician?" Which, I guess the answer was yes, he kind of was. This is a quantitative science. But Roosevelt himself didn't sort of buy it. In fact, Roosevelt, who stepped on the gas very hard, to use that automotive metaphor, beginning in 1933, let up the gas. And as a result, 1937, the economy fell back into recession. It was essentially a double dip. It was a recession within a depression, which almost doesn't seem like it's possible, almost a textbook anomaly, but it did happen. And Keynes was saying, don't let off the gas because we're not at full employment yet. Instead, what you need to do is step on the gas, increase government spending. And increase government spending on what? Well, it doesn't really matter. And Keynes was very clear, it doesn't matter what it does, because spending is going to result in income somewhere else. And so it doesn't make any difference. In fact, he talked about the idea of the government. He had sort of a wacky idea the government could just bury he called a bottle of diamonds. And I don't know where this idea came from, a bottle of diamonds in a mountain, and that firms would compete to go, whoever found a bottle of diamonds would have these great riches. But it didn't matter. Firms hiring workers who turned those wages into spending, all of which boosted the economy, which meant the government at some point doesn't have to be there. Government just has to, what he called, prime the pump. That is sort of it's a jump start to get the economy going. And then government can let off the gas. And I think this is where a lot of the critics of Keynes sort of get him wrong, because they sort of think that he was sort of an early socialist. And I don't think that tag works on Keynes very well. Keynes became a millionaire by trading currencies and stocks and sat on the board of an insurance company. I don't think he was a socialist at all. He was the richest socialist in the world, if he was, that's for sure. Instead, he's simply saying, we need government because government is ours to begin with, and the government can do things that nobody else can do because they've got the ability to print money and do all these kinds of things. Now, here's why I think a lot of economists today are hard on the policymakers of the day, is because the policymakers were saying, look, if we spend money here, we're going to have a deficit. We're going to spend more than what we're taking in taxes. We can't do that, right? Now, today, our government has long gotten over that idea of spending more than what it takes in. We do this routinely every year. And by the way, if you've been following what's going on in Washington right now, there's this big debate over what's going on with the debt ceiling. This comes up every, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, where Congress argues with the president over raising the debt. The debt ceiling comes up with the borrowing limit set for the US government because the US government funds its spending in excess of taxes by borrowing. That's the way that they fund it. It's a form of debt savings. Well, today, we've been doing it for a long time, and nothing really has happened. And Keynes was saying we should do it. At the time, the government was convinced they shouldn't do it. It's irresponsible. And they had this idea that today is now considered, I think, it's the idea that, hey, households balance their budget, Congress should balance its own. Besides the fact that it's an incorrect view of how the economy works, it's also irrelevant. And the reason it's irrelevant is because, first of all, it doesn't matter what households do. Households and governments are different entities. Households can't print money. They can't change interest rates. They can't do all kinds of things. They can't go on and off gold standards. Households and governments are different by definition. That's why we classify them as being different. So that's one thing. The other thing, even by their own definition, it doesn't make sense. If you're a household and you earn $100,000 a year, good income, and you borrow $300,000 a year to buy a house, that will make you a deficit spender because you borrowed money. And nobody says, "Hey, I can't believe you're being irresponsible by borrowing money to buy a house," right? I mean, it's one thing to spend $300,000 on credit cards, on vacations and dinners out and all that. This is actually buying something of long-term value. And I think that's really what Keynes was talking about when he talked about this fairly ludicrous example of burying diamonds in a mountain. I think what he's really saying is, look, it doesn't really make any difference. It can be an absurd example. He even talked about the idea of hiring 100 people in the first shift to dig a hole, second shift to fill the hole back up. Sorts of crazy examples then sort of add to those who already want to attack the theory as being a bit ludicrous, right? It sounds like a government project, doesn't it? Digging holes and filling them back up. But what Keynes was saying, it doesn't make, as long as we get something going in the economy, get it jump started. And so what you've got here is this idea of the multiplier taking effect. So we talked about one multiplier back early on when we talked about consumption and savings. The multiplier was the difference of the residual 1 over NPS. Well, here, what is the multiplier? Sort of writ large. This is a macro spending multiplier. And the multiplier simply is this. It's the change in GDP that you get divided by the change in government spending. Okay. So, whatever amount, if you get and this is a larger region here. So if you get, let's say you're $250 million and you get $1 billion of benefit here, then it obviously means that you get what? You get $1 billion divided by 250 million. So you have a multiplier of 4. And so what that means is that you get 4 times the bang for the buck, because what you do is you set in motion a chain of spending and that then rides itself out and back to full employment. And that what Keynes is suggesting we do is simply spend money over and above what we're taking in at the governmental level in order to take a small amount to make it into a much bigger amount. This is why this sliver is a little bit small. It may not be 4 times as small. You get the idea. That we spend a little bit in order to get a bigger amount. And this is how the multiplier takes effect. It's the change in GDP divided by whatever the stimulus is. And by the way, it could be stimulus to investment if it's targeted that way, or to consumption if it's targeted that way. The multiplier is this idea that we get some sort of change over and above what we put into the mix.
The use of this model, this might be a controversial topic, but the government spending still trying to pass more of aid
Ukraine. Yeah. Yeah, well, and I mean, it's part of the picture, and I know some people don't think that spending money on Ukraine is a worthwhile endeavor, and that's That's their particular point of view. There's a political angle to it as well. And that is that it seems like Washington's sort of stuck in this game of us versus them, always, always. I'm talking about Congress and the president. And it's almost like the student loan thing that's going on right now, where President Biden, basically made a presidential decree that we were going to forgive what 10,000 or 20,000, depending upon your situation, to people who've got student loan debt. And he was being sued by people who had really no connection to student loan debt at all, because I think it was just politically motivated. I mean, their argument is, and it's unfortunately, I think, receiving receiving a serious hearing before the Supreme Court. Their argument is, okay, if you forgive debt $10,000, then I have to pay tax on that $10,000 at the state level, which means what? Even at the highest state rates, say 8%, you'll get 10,000 forgiven, and you have to pay 800 more in taxes. And somehow that's unfair. That's the argument. That's the argument that they're actually taking to the Supreme Court, saying, I don't want to pay $800 because they're giving me $10,000. It's a ridiculous argument. It may have some legal merit, but I think that whole argument, frankly, comes from the state of Indiana, which is a very Republican state, and and that they're arguing that we shouldn't have the debt forgiveness because of that one issue. I think it's politically motivated. It's to stymie what President Biden wants to do. And whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, you could be on any side of the political debate. You think, well, and because I've heard very liberal people say, well, why should we forgive student debt? Because all of us have to go to work and pay our student debt. It's not really so much the point. It's not really who's deserving. It's what's good for the economy, I think, is the issue. And frankly, a lot of colleges have just gotten out of control with tuition to the point where now it's like it was before student aid began in the first place. It's becoming very expensive. And this is why I think we have such good enrollment at CNM, because this is a very inexpensive place to go, because we get lots of state subsidies as a result. And I'm not trying to sell CNM here. I'm not being paid to promote CNM. It's not my job. I'm stating a fact. I'm not being rewarded. Hey, you didn't promote CNM enough today, right? So, but it's simply a fact. You can take this course here, or you can go to UNM and take it. It's up to you. You can pay more, or you can pay less. It's up to you. So anyway, that's the issue. Now, one other thing, and I do want to, in the interest of fairness, and I do want to be fair to the policymakers of the day. There was one other thing that is not often talked about, because what oftentimes people are critical of the government in the 1930s was the fact that they're afraid to borrow money, they're afraid to go into debt. That it was somehow, and by the way, a lot of people at the time were thinking that borrowing was somehow sinful, I guess, is maybe the word, right? In fact, there are a lot of people who believe that borrowing money itself was in itself a form of corruption. You can't live within your means, you're going to borrow money. And I think we've gotten over that sort of thing. And even Roosevelt himself talked about lenders as being money changers. Well, where have you heard the term money changers, right? It comes out of the New Testament. Money changers are these evil bankers, right? And, whatnot. And I would admit, I was a former banker, and I don't know that they're evil. They may do stupid things at times, but I don't know that they're evil. And they're simply channeling money to people who have demand for money. So the idea that borrowing money is shadowy and irresponsible and equivalent to being a drug addict or something is really just not, it's really overblown. So I think people have that issue. But one other issue that I do give policymakers a little bit of leeway on is this idea of what is called the reserve currency. And that is the idea that the US dollar was backed by gold. And the fact of the matter is that the US dollar had risen in prominence against the British pound at least 100 years or more, to the extent that we had a modern economy at all, was the world's reserve currency, meaning it was the world's gold standard of currency, if it's where everyone flocked to because it was the model of stability. Now, by the way, it's often synonymous too with very strong militaries. And at the time, before World War I, Britain had the world's strongest navy, at least, to protect its shipping lanes and trade. They were the world leaders for many, many decades in terms of trade, for better or for worse. I know that you can look at the colonial argument as being worse for a lot of people on the labor end of things, no question about that. But nonetheless, from a currency standpoint, it did make trade. But after World War I, a war that probably, in hindsight, maybe Britain shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. Their economy was decimated. They lost a lot of in the war, lots of manpower, lots of and I say manpower deliberately because it was mostly men that died in the war. And so a lot of workers went, and so as a result, the US economy was the big winner. So the US dollar rose to prominence. And the feeling was, why should we create more demand for goods and more money being floating around out there when we don't have the gold to support it? And we therefore are doing the disservice to the rest of the world and to ourselves by deflating the value of the dollar, which is essentially what goes on with that whole issue. And so I think that was an argument that was being made. It's an argument you don't hear very often. You do hear it among economists, but it's one that I think is an important one. So, you know, I do give a little bit of leeway to Herbert Hoover and some of his cohorts in Washington who at the time were very skeptical of this idea. And so I get that idea what we didn't know then. Now, by the way, there's one element missing here, that's net exports. And simply put, you can deal with this as you like. This is sort of, if you have positive net exports here, where C plus I plus G, and it's plus here at net exports, then you get a boost to the economy. And so as a result, Y goes up as a result of that. If it goes the other direction, we have C plus I, E plus I plus G minus net exports, then you get a drop in the economy. And these are probably exaggerated moves here, but or Y goes in that direction. So that's simply an explanation using this model as to what those are about. But the net exports piece is not really the critical element here. This really has more to do with domestic government action to deal with the domestic. Follow this prescription. They can take an economy back where actual GDP is less than potential GDP and get to full employment. That's essentially the heart of the Keynesian argument. It's this idea of being able to move the economy to a condition of full employment, and because only government is the actor that can do it. Only government can do it. Only government is the one that can do it. So anyway, so any questions about that? That's a little bit involved. There's more to it than that, I know. And if you really want to reach Appendix B, feel free to do so. I can't tell you not to do something, but I think I'm really trying to do the class a bit of a favor here by trying to sort of summarize a lot of what's going on here. And because if you some of that deals with net investment, it's basically inventory swings. If you want to read about it, you can feel free to, but instead, I think a better way to view it is what we picked up on from there. Now, by the way, there is one element of this that sort of ties into, I guess I shouldn't have dimmed the lights just yet, and that is, how do we go from this aggregate expenditures model to aggregate demand? And by the way, when we talk about aggregates, I think it's important to know that macroeconomics, which today we all take for granted as being a thing, right? I mean, that's why we're here in this particular, we're not in some other class, we're in a macroeconomics class. Well, today we take it for granted, but it shouldn't be taken for granted because it exists as a thing prior to the 1930s. There was no term macroeconomics, and there's some debate as to who coined the term in the first place. But essentially what's going on here is this: how does this tie in to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Well, if you go back to, and I'll just sort of draw this a little bit here and just draw various elements of aggregate expenditure here, C plus I plus G, etc. And this is on the model of aggregate expenditures on this axis, GDP on this axis, and GDP on this axis. And now we've gone to the PY plane that we've already begun talking about. Is the fact that you can line up all these then translate to different elements of, and I probably didn't draw these very well. Let me try this a little bit better. Let me put the 45-degree line. That might give me a little bit better guideline here for where we go. Okay. And so you've got these elements of aggregate expenditure look like this. Sort of line up here. And they all line up with various elements of aggregate spending throughout the economy. And as a result of this, we see that we have this condition where if we begin to spend more money, we end up with different points of aggregate expenditure. And so we simply are lining these up. This is where aggregate demand essentially is justified just from the expenditures standpoint there. Why do we have the different price levels? It's because it's the configuration of aggregate spending that is aggregate demand in relation to the price level. All these things we talked about before. The real balance is effect. We know that people spend more as the inflation rate comes down, spend less as the inflation rate goes up. So we can simply bring one factor into this model, that's the inflation rate. This is an area that Keynes did not make this association. This came a bit later. In fact, this graph of aggregate expenditures, I don't know that Keynes himself drew this out. I don't recall seeing it in the general theory. In fact, it's usually thought of as having been sort of fleshed out in a graphical form by a guy named Sir John Hicks, who later would, I think he won a Nobel Prize a little bit later. Hicks took a lot of Keynes's ideas and became really an early Keynesian. And a lot of this work sort of reshapes modern economic thinking, especially given the fact that macro didn't really exist as a thing. Because part of what Keynes was saying is, look, the macroeconomy that we all know of today is not just simply a collection of microeconomic markets. If we define microeconomics as the study of markets, then the macroeconomic form is a collection of all individual markets. And Keynes was saying that's not really it, because you've got things that are going on in macro that are unique to macroeconomics as a whole. You've got the government, first of all, that fits in a very big way. What doesn't fit into microeconomic thinking very much are things like taxation and government spending, deficit spending when it needs to happen, things like interest rates and whatnot, which Keynes was skeptical of as a means to manage the economy, particularly when you've got a very big recessionary gap, which certainly in the 1930s, there was a gigantic recessionary gap because the economy had just gotten unwound and needed to be sort of put back together again, you know? And so you get the idea here that you know, the economy really needs to be mending, and it needs to be bended, okay? So this is part of the logic of this, is the idea the government is one factor that does not play into the role very much in micro, that the macroeconomy is not just simply a collection of individual markets. There's something different going on. Things like exports and imports, which are not a big part of this, but they're here. There are things like deficit spending, taxation. These are all elements that fit into this. So macro sort of came into its realm by this recognition that it's more than just simply a collection of markets together. Okay. All right. So what are some of the tenets, the background of Keynesianism? Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button here, and so I keep making a mistake with the. Bear with me, guys, in the room here, because I know you're not seeing what I'm seeing. So, okay, all right. So, what are some of the tenets of Keynesianism? And by the way, we're going to spin a lot of these on their head when we talk about the classical, the neoclassicists. So, what about Keynes, and what are we talking about here in terms of some of his big theories? Well, first of all, is Keynes believed, as did his later followers, some of whom are simply now called neo-Keynesians or new Keynesians, that Keynes believed the macroeconomy is inherently unstable. This is, I think, a view that I think most people can agree with for the most part. I will just tell you that I think it's a lot more unstable than what people give it credit for. And I say that only because, and I don't know that I would have bought this maybe some time ago when I first entered this occupation. But we've now seen, just in my adult life, we've seen 3 stock market crashes. We've seen a collapse of the banking system. We've seen a collapse of the savings and loan industry. We have seen massive dislocations in manufacturing in this country. There have been lots of changes. The economy is fragile. It's very fragile. And a lot of times, I think one way to view the macroeconomy is this sort of house of cards very often. And it's really propped up by nothing more sturdy than the popsicle sticks of government involvement. And that's very tenuous because government sometimes pulls the rug out from underneath the economy. And I think this debt ceiling debate is really dangerous because it's being done for and only political purposes, and it's playing chicken with the economy. I think it's really bad policy. But I think the idea that it's inherently unstable is probably a pretty good one. I think that the economy, I think, are unstable and are very wobbly. I mean, you know, I think people can become wealthy overnight. They can become broke overnight. I think it's very possible. And when I say overnight, I don't mean literally overnight, but I mean very quickly. So the economy is inherently unstable, particularly the idea of consumers and households, because here's what Keynes is saying. If households can't do the job of spending, and businesses can't or won't do the job of spending, remember, this is about demand, then it's got to be government that creates demand for goods, okay? Because you can't rely on the private sector to do it. You have to have government involved because it's the only actor left. You've only got three actors: households, firms, and government. If two actors can't or won't deliver in terms of creating the demand for goods, then it's got to be there. And by the way, let's come back to this idea that we've talked about before, and that's the idea that if we start to save, it sounds like a great thing, but it ends up short-circuiting the income. And this is what's called the paradox of thrift. We've talked about a bit about this before, and it's really a maddening thing, because I think most of us would agree that savings has got real virtue, right? There's a real value in it, particularly for retirement and for, saving money for worthwhile purposes and whatnot, for emergencies. But every time we save $1, it means there's one less dollar spent in the economy. And I know that people might say, well, okay, not really, because that dollar could get loaned out to somebody if you put it in the bank. Well, maybe and maybe not, because, and this is something Keynes talked about, okay, you put money in the bank, well, it doesn't, borrowers are going to borrow, or that lenders are going to want to lend, because sometimes banks don't want to lend money. And any evidence of this, you can simply look back to the financial crisis of 2009, when banks were having trouble and bank credit was sort of hard to get. And the Treasury Secretary at the time, Hank Paulson, said, look, I can't make banks lend money if they don't want to. So that's a pretty good indication of the fact that there's an unwillingness to force banks to lend. In fact, just the opposite. We've seen banks being forced not to lend back in the late 70s, early 80s, when there was a so-called credit crunch, where the government tried to really slow down the economy by telling banks to dial it back, that sort of thing. So you get the idea that it's difficult. And by the way, this sort of leads to this idea of fiscal policy being the preferred instrument, because of the fact that monetary policy essentially works through the financial system. And that is the idea: if the economy is slow, then the government can raise lower interest rates, the lower borrowing costs. And so as a result, people want to buy houses. Businesses who want to buy equipment and new plants are more able to do it because the rate is low and it's more affordable. But here's the thing: if they don't want to do it, they are not do it. You can't make somebody buy a house or make a firm buy an 18-wheeler. You can't do it, right? You can't make these businesses do things they don't want to do, and households can't be made. But the government can spend really quickly right away. This is why we have what we call stimulus. So today, I think we're all stimulus, but it's been around for quite a while. It really originated with Keynes. And he's saying, look, we don't need government to take over the economy, which is one of the criticisms that some of his critics, I think, from an ill-informed opinion, they've criticized him for saying he wants to take over the government. He wants this to be sort of a socialist state. And I don't think that's true. In fact, I think the idea of tagging Keynes with that is really problematic, given the fact that he was a really wealthy guy. And I don't think he would have liked living in a socialist state, frankly, and nor did he ever say. In fact, it's quite the contrary. He talked about communism as, and of course, he tended to write in hyperbolic terms. He exaggerated a lot, but said that communism was simply a rewarding of the mud over the fish, which I thought was strange. But he writes a lot of strange analogies, the mud over the fish. So he did not think that that communism was the way to go, and even socialism. So government can play a role in stabilizing the economy. Fiscal policy is a preferred instrument. And that the goal of macro policy is full employment. And why do I underline this? Because when we get into the classical theory next week, we're going to talk about the preferred goal being different. It's not full employment, it's stable prices. This is what opened Keynes up to a lot of criticism in the years long after he died, about 20 or so years afterwards, was the fact that inflation was beginning to be a much bigger problem, and that Keynes doesn't really have an answer for it. In fact, he's saying that prices don't have to rise at all. And by the way, we're going to come back to this idea a bit later in the class and talk about when we sort of synthesize both the Keynesian and neoclassical views. We're going to talk about how we may be able to arrive at some accommodation with both of them. I'll sort of defer that a bit to our next week. But Keynes is saying the goal is full employment. Others are saying no, inflation and price stability is the thing. Now, in Keynes's defense, I think that had he lived another 20 years or so and saw the inflation of the 1960s, well, it's due to too much government involvement. I never said on government spending. And I think that one of the criticisms of government is the idea the government was spending money like crazy in the 1960s in this country and elsewhere on things like the Vietnam War, the space program, all the expansion of sort of government involved in the economy. Medicare and Medicaid came online. I'm not saying these were bad programs, but they probably were introduced too quickly and the supply side can't catch up. That's what happens whenever aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supplies. You have a classic case of demand pull inflation. And I think that, and we're going to talk about the work of Milton Friedman. I think that most economists today, as much as they might have disagreed with Milton Friedman in a lot of areas, he is the exemplar of the classical school and his argument against excessive government involvement generally. And his criticism of government even goes beyond just government's involvement, but in some cases their very existence in some fashion. So yeah.
I know the term trickle-down economics is used a lot, but outside of just the name, what are the policies of that slightly?
Well, yeah, I think trickle-down economics is basically a view of that says, okay, look, the government doesn't have to do anything, that these things will work themselves out. Because remember, what one thing Keynes is trying to do in this model is to say, look, that maybe the economy will get its way to full employment at some point. Okay, maybe it'll get there. Maybe it'll take a while, but it'll get there. And Keynes was very much a short-run theorist. In fact, he's famous for saying that pushing back on his critics who said, well, in the long run, because he was saying, well, in the long run, we're all dead, right? That's his famous saying. In the long run, we're all dead. And so what's the point, right? He's saying, let's do something now because we can't wait for eventually workers to take wage decreases. Firms are eventually going to run out of inventory to sell, and people are going to need to have inventory and shoes and clothes and food and vehicles and whatnot. Yes, the economy will probably get its way to full employment, but we can't wait that long. We can't wait for it all to trickle down to everybody by the fact that maybe businesses want to spend and maybe bankers want to open their wallets and lend money. We just can't wait. Trickle-down economics works with the fact that our begin to create demand for goods in the economy that eventually their way through the economy. Trickle-down economics is really not so much a formal economic theory, but more of a criticism of those who would think that we could just simply wait and let the economy work its way out of its own problems, which is essentially a classical view. And by the way, was when the classicists sort of reinvigorated themselves sometime after Keynes died, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that trickle-down economics was really the criticism of a lot of policies which sought to unwind some of Keynes's views. And so trickle-down is more of a criticism as far as anything else goes. Okay. So any questions about this particular set of theories here? It's an interesting bit of theory. I think Keynes is a very interesting person. I think his thinking was very adroit, and he had a lot to do with setting the stage of the macroeconomics as it exists today. Even though there are some who disagree with his policies, I think he's made a bit of a resurgence in recent years, because if we take a look at some of the push-pull here, Keynes was really big throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Then the classes sort of like Carrie kind of came back from the dead, right? Like, everyone see the movie Carrie, or am I the oldest person here and showing my age, right? Well, then the Keynesians are sort of back, right? And they've been big for the last 20 or so years. And so it's interesting that there's these macro theories. And so it's an interesting debate that goes on. And it really centers on that's the whole government. Okay. All right. Well, everybody have a great weekend. See you next time.